Thomas froze mid-step, his breath forming icy clouds in the bitter air. He had been tracking movement in the snow, expecting a deer, but there it was. A German shepherd curled protectively around her pups, their tiny bodies trembling in the frost. He raised his rifle instinctively, unsure if danger lurked nearby. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl from deep in the forest made his heart race. Wolves. Time was running out, and he had to decide. Leave them or risk his own life to save theirs. The forest was an expanse of icy stillness, the silence broken only by the soft crunch of snow under Thomas's boots. His breath clouded the air as he moved steadily through the frosty expanse, rifle slung over his shoulder. Years of hunting had taught him to read the subtle signs left behind by creatures of the wild, but this morning felt different, unsettling. Ahead of him, faint paw prints in the snow veered off the main trail, their size and erratic path catching his attention. He crouched to examine them, frowning. They were too small for a wolf, too scattered to belong to a fox. The prints told a story of desperation, zigzagging without direction, and they vanished into the dense cluster of trees ahead. Thomas stood, his instincts tingling. Adjusting his rifle, he followed the tracks deeper into the woods, his pace quickening as the unease in his chest grew heavier. The snow here was untouched, a pristine white blanket muffling all sound. Only the faint howl of a wolf in the distance punctuated the quiet, a reminder that this forest belonged to more than just him. Then he saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow huddled beneath a pine tree, barely visible against the snow, but as he approached, the shape became clearer. A dog, a German shepherd. She was curled into a tight ball, her thin body trembling violently against the cold. Around her were 4 tiny puppies, barely more than a month old, scattered haphazardly in the snow. Their small bodies were coated with frost, and their shallow breaths barely disturbed the icy air. The sight stopped Thomas in his tracks. The mother dog lifted her head weakly as he drew closer, her amber eyes locking onto him with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. Her ears perked slightly, but the rest of her body remained motionless, as though she could no longer summon the strength to move. Thomas took in the scene before him. Her filthy, matted coat clung to a gaunt frame, old scars crisscrossed her muzzle, and one of her ears was torn. This was no ordinary stray. She had suffered greatly, yet she still clung to life for the sake of her pups. Thomas's eyes moved to the puppies, each one barely stirring in the snow. Their black and tan fur, damp and speckled with frost, did little to shield them from the biting cold. One of them let out the faintest of whimpers before falling silent again. A low growl rumbled from the mother's throat, weak but determined. Her body shifted slightly, as if she were trying to shield her puppies from this stranger. Thomas froze, raising his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." The growl softened, but didn't disappear entirely. The mother's amber eyes stayed fixed on him, unblinking. She was afraid, but there was something else in her gaze, a silent plea. Thomas crouched a few feet away, scanning her condition more closely. Her body trembled not just from the cold, but from sheer exhaustion. She had likely been out here for days, possibly longer. The thought sent a pang through his chest. No creature should have to endure this, much less one trying to protect her young. A sudden, distant howl shattered the moment. Thomas's head snapped up, his pulse quickening. The wolves were closer now, their calls echoing through the trees. He glanced around, his hunter's instincts kicking in. The tracks he'd followed must have attracted their attention. If he didn't act quickly, the mother and her pups wouldn't stand a chance. The growling returned, sharper this time. Thomas turned back to the German shepherd, her eyes now darting toward the tree line. She sensed the danger as acutely as he did. She shifted again, her trembling body pressing closer to her puppies, as if preparing to defend them one last time. Thomas clenched his jaw. He couldn't leave them here. "All right," he muttered under his breath, shifting his rifle onto his back. "We don't have time for this." Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a wool blanket, the only extra layer he had brought with him. Slowly he spread it over the puppies, tucking them in as gently as he could. Their small bodies barely stirred, but the faint warmth of the blanket seemed to settle them. The mother growled again, her ears flattening as he worked. "I know," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm, But if I don't help, they're not going to make it. Neither are you." She didn't move, but the growl softened once more. Her eyes followed his every movement, watching as he carefully wrapped each puppy in the blanket. Their weight was almost negligible as he lifted them, cradling the bundle close to his chest. The mother let out a low whine, shifting onto her front legs as if to follow, but her body gave out, and she collapsed back into the snow. Thomas cursed under his breath. She was too weak to walk on her own, and the wolves were closing in. "Come on," he urged, his tone sharper now. "I'm not leaving without you." The mother raised her head slightly, her gaze flicking between him and her pups. Her body trembled as she tried again to stand, but it was no use. She let out another whine, this one softer, almost resigned. Thomas glanced over his shoulder. The howls were louder now, more distinct. The wolves were circling, their cries echoing from different directions. His grip on the puppies tightened. "Damn it," he muttered. Without wasting another second, he knelt beside the mother, looping his arms under her frail body. She flinched, but didn't resist as he lifted her. Her weight was heavier than he expected, but he adjusted his grip, careful not to jostle her too much. Balancing the bundled puppies against his chest and the mother's weight on his shoulder, Thomas straightened, his legs straining against the snow. The cold bit into his exposed hands and face, but he ignored it. The wolves' howls were deafening now, their presence almost tangible in the dense forest. Thomas took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I don't know if we're going to make it," he said quietly. His words meant as much for himself as for the dog. "But I'm not leaving you here." With that, he turned and began the slow, grueling trek back toward his cabin, the weight of his decision pressing down on him as heavily as the snow underfoot. The snow crunched heavily under Thomas's boots as he trudged through the forest, the weight of the mother German shepherd on his shoulder, and the bundled puppies pressed tightly against his chest. His breath came in short, visible puffs, and his muscles burned from the effort. But he didn't stop. The cold bit at his exposed hands, and the distant howls of wolves spurred him forward. Glancing over his shoulder, he could see the mother dog's head hanging low, her amber eyes half closed with exhaustion. Yet, even in her weakened state, her ears twitched at every sound, her body tense as if bracing for an attack. There was something fiercely protective about her, a strength that defied her frailty. The wolves were closing in. Thomas's ears picked up faint rustling in the underbrush, the unmistakable sound of paws crunching through the snow. The pack was circling, their howls growing louder and more coordinated, echoing through the dense trees. They were testing him, gauging his speed, his weakness. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, adjusting his grip on the dog and the puppies. He couldn't afford to stop, not now. A low growl rumbled from the shepherd. She lifted her head weakly, her ears perked and eyes flickering toward the shadows between the trees. Thomas followed her gaze, his heart hammering in his chest, as he caught sight of movement, a blur of gray darting through the snow. "They're getting bold," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the growing panic gnawing at him. The shepherd let out a weak bark, her body twitching as if she were trying to free herself from his grasp. Thomas tightened his hold, his voice firm but calm. "Stay still, girl. I've got you." But the wolves weren't waiting. One of them stepped into the clearing ahead, its eyes gleaming in the pale moonlight. It was a large male, its coat thick and dark, its posture low and predatory. It stared at Thomas, its head tilting slightly as if sizing him up. The shepherd snarled, her teeth baring despite her exhaustion. Her growl was low and unsteady, but it carried an undeniable defiance. "Easy," Thomas muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. He shifted the puppies in his arms, trying to keep them as still and warm as possible. The wolf took a step forward, its head lowering further, its growl rumbling in its throat. Thomas's pulse quickened, his body tensing as he calculated his next move. If the pack attacked now, he wouldn't stand a chance, not while carrying the dogs. A second wolf appeared, this one smaller but equally menacing, its yellow eyes fixed on Thomas. The two predators began to circle, their movements slow and deliberate. Thomas cursed under his breath, his mind racing. He could try to scare them off with a warning shot, but the risk of drawing more wolves was too great. Then, something unexpected happened. The mother shepherd twisted in his arms with a sudden burst of energy, forcing him to lower her to the ground. She staggered as her paws hit the snow, her legs trembling. But she didn't collapse. Instead, She planted herself firmly between Thomas and the wolves, her body low and her teeth bared. "Are you crazy?" Thomas hissed, stepping forward to pull her back, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't fear. It was something primal, something fierce. The shepherd's growl grew louder, her body shaking with the effort, but she didn't waver. The wolves hesitated, their circling slowing as they regarded her. Thomas stood frozen, his rifle raised, but his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He could see it now. This wasn't just a desperate mother. There was something extraordinary about her. A protective instinct so strong it seemed to defy her physical limits. One of the wolves lunged, snapping at the air as it tested her resolve. The shepherd didn't back down. She lunged forward, her growl erupting into a bark that echoed through the clearing. The sudden ferocity of her movement startled the wolves, and they stopped, their ears flattening. "That's right," Thomas murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not just any dog, are you?" The wolves hesitated for a moment longer, their predatory gaze shifting between Thomas and the shepherd. Finally, with a frustrated growl, the larger wolf retreated, melting back into the shadows of the forest. The others followed, their eyes lingering for a moment before they disappeared into the trees. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The shepherd collapsed into the snow, her body trembling violently as the last of her strength gave out. "All right," Thomas said, kneeling beside her. "You've done your part. Let me take it from here." He scooped her up again, adjusting the puppies in his coat before continuing toward the cabin. The wolves didn't follow this time, but the tension lingered, pressing down on him like the weight of the snow-laden branches overhead. When the cabin finally came into view, Thomas quickened his pace, relief flooding through him. The structure was small and weathered, but it was safe, warm. He stepped onto the porch, his boots creaking against the wooden planks, and glanced back at the forest. The tree line was still, the wolves gone, but the unease in his chest remained. Inside, he gently laid the shepherd on a pile of blankets near the fireplace. She let out a soft whine, her eyes fluttering open to look at her pups, who were now nestled safely in the warmth of his coat. As he stoked the fire, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their trouble. There was something about the shepherd that felt different. She wasn't just any dog, and this wasn't just any chance encounter. Sitting back, he watched the firelight dance across the room, illuminating the scars on her face and the faint rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. "What's your story?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. The shepherd didn't respond, of course, but her gaze met his for a moment before her eyes drifted shut. Thomas leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at him. Whatever secrets this dog carried, he would uncover them in time. For now, they were safe. But deep in his gut, he knew the forest hadn't given up on them yet. Inside the warmth of the cabin, the biting chill of the forest seemed like a distant memory. Thomas carefully placed the bundled puppies on a thick blanket near the crackling fireplace. The heat from the flames began to spread, melting the frost clinging to their fragile bodies. He knelt beside them, his hands gently unwrapping the woolen coat they had been tucked into. One by one, the puppies began to stir, their tiny, shivering forms pressed against one another instinctively, drawing comfort from the shared warmth. Thomas's brow furrowed as his fingers brushed against the smallest of the litter. This puppy, smaller and frailer than the rest, barely moved. Its breathing was shallow, its soft whimpers barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "You're hanging on by a thread, aren't you?" Thomas muttered, carefully scooping the little one into his calloused hands. Its tiny body felt like it could break under the slightest pressure. He gently rubbed its sides, trying to stimulate warmth and life into the fragile creature. Nearby, the mother shepherd, whom he had begun to call Luna, lay curled on another blanket. Her body was still trembling, though less violently than before. Her amber eyes were fixed intently on the puppies, never leaving them for more than a moment. Despite her exhaustion, there was a tension in her gaze, a deep and raw fear that lingered just beneath the surface. Thomas leaned back on his heels, glancing at her. "You did everything you could for them out there," he said softly. "It's a miracle they're even alive." Luna's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but her focus remained on her pups. There was something unnerving about her intensity, as though she were bracing for something terrible to happen. Thomas felt a pang of sympathy as he reached out to place a small bowl of water near her. "Here," he murmured, "you need this more than I do." At first, Luna didn't move, Her eyes flicked to him warily, then back to the puppies. It was only when Thomas stepped away that she slowly, hesitantly, lowered her head to lap at the water. Her movements were cautious, as though every second she spent drinking was a second too long away from her pups. Thomas busied himself checking the rest of the puppies. The larger ones were beginning to show signs of improvement. Small movements, soft sounds, faint signs of life returning to their tiny bodies. But the smallest one still lay limp in his hands, and his jaw tightened as he placed it closer to the fire. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "Don't give up yet." He stood, stretching his aching legs, and crossed the room to grab more blankets. As he turned back toward Luna, his eyes caught a faint gleam of metal around her neck. He frowned, setting the blankets aside as he moved closer. Kneeling beside her, he carefully brushed back the matted fur around her neck. Beneath the dirt and grime, a thin metallic collar came into view. His fingers traced the cold surface, and he realized it wasn't an ordinary collar. It was a band of weathered metal, engraved with numbers and symbols that had faded over time. "What's this?" he muttered, squinting at the strange markings. The numbers were partially scratched out, but enough remained to pique his curiosity. XM07. Thomas leaned back, turning the collar slightly to get a better look. The symbols around the numbers were unfamiliar, almost military in appearance. He had seen a lot of collars in his time: hunting tags, pet IDs, even identification tags from working dogs. But this was something different. "Where did you come from?" he asked softly, his voice more to himself than to Luna. Luna let out a low whine, her gaze darting between Thomas and her pups. She shifted uncomfortably, as though the collar itself were a source of pain or bad memories. Thomas's brow furrowed as he gently loosened the metal band, giving her neck some relief. The numbers stuck in his mind as he stood and moved toward the small desk in the corner of the cabin. He kept a worn journal there, along with a pencil and a few other odds and ends. Scribbling the markings into the journal, he made a mental note to look into them later. For now, there were more immediate concerns. Thomas returned to the fire, crouching beside the puppies once again. He checked their breathing, their small movements, and made sure they were close enough to the warmth without risking overheating. The smallest one still worried him. It had stopped whimpering altogether, and its tiny chest rose and fell so faintly he had to strain to see it. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You've got to pull through," he said quietly. "Your mom's been through enough. Don't make her lose you too." Luna's ears twitched at his words, and she let out another soft whine. She seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, her gaze shifting toward the smallest pup as though willing it to survive. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with a faint warmth that was both physical and emotional. Yet, despite the calmness of the room, Thomas couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his chest. The collar, the strange markings, Luna's scars and cautious demeanor, it all pointed to a story he didn't yet understand. What kind of life had this dog lived? Who had put that collar on her, and why? And why had she and her pups been abandoned in the middle of a frozen forest, left to die? Thomas glanced out the small window, his eyes scanning the dark tree line beyond the cabin. The wolves hadn't followed them here, but something about the forest felt watchful, as though it were holding its breath. He turned back to the fire, his jaw tightening. Whatever secrets Luna carried, he would find them out. But for now, there was only one priority: keeping her and her pups alive. Thomas settled onto the floor beside them, his rifle resting within arm's reach. Luna's amber eyes met his briefly before she lowered her head onto her paws, finally allowing herself to rest. "Rest while you can," he murmured, his gaze drifting back to the faint glow of the fire. "We'll need our strength for whatever comes next." The crackling of the fire filled the silence as Thomas leaned back, his mind churning with questions that the quiet night refused to answer. The following morning Thomas rose early, his mind restless from the events of the previous day. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but the cabin was still warm. Luna lay curled protectively around her puppies, her amber eyes fluttering open as Thomas moved quietly around the room. The pups seemed stronger now, their faint breath steadier as they nestled close to their mother. Even the smallest of them, the one Thomas had worried might not survive, had begun to stir with weak but promising movements. Despite the progress, an unease lingered in his chest. Thomas's thoughts returned to the strange collar around Luna's neck and the markings engraved on it. XM07. He couldn't ignore the question swirling in his mind. Where had she come from? And why had someone abandoned her and her pups in the middle of the forest? He needed answers. After a quick breakfast and ensuring Luna and the pups were safe and warm, Thomas grabbed his rifle and set out. The air was sharp and cold as he retraced his steps through the snow-covered forest, following the faint trail they had taken the day before. The wolves were gone, their tracks obscured by the fresh snow, but Thomas kept his rifle ready. It wasn't long before he found it, the old truck he'd spotted during the frantic journey back to the cabin. It was a rusted, dented thing, partially hidden beneath a thick layer of snow. The windshield was cracked, and one of the doors hung slightly ajar. Thomas approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The forest was still, but the silence felt heavy, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. He reached the truck and pulled open the driver's door, the hinges groaning in protest. The cab was a mess, the seats torn and the floor littered with trash. Amid the debris, Thomas's eyes caught sight of a stack of papers stuffed into the glove compartment. Carefully, he pulled the papers out, his brow furrowing as he examined them. They were crumpled and water-stained, but some of the writing was still legible. Most of it appeared to be mundane. Delivery receipts, a faded map of the area. But one piece of paper stood out. It was a small folded note, the edges torn and smudged. Thomas unfolded it, his stomach tightening as he read the words scrawled across it in harsh, jagged letters. "Don't trust them. Don't let them live." He stared at the note, his mind racing. Them? Who was them? His gaze shifted to the back of the truck, where the faint outlines of paw prints led away from the vehicle. Shaking his head, Thomas climbed into the cab and began searching more thoroughly. Underneath the seat, he found a small leather folder. Inside were more documents. This time, they painted a darker picture. The papers revealed that the truck had been registered to a private facility specializing in protection dog training. Thomas frowned as he read further. The facility was located miles from here, hidden deep in the wilderness, and it claimed to train guard dogs for elite security purposes. But the details didn't add up. Many of the handwritten notes in the folder referenced harsh training techniques, including methods that bordered on abuse. One paper included a list of dogs with corresponding identification numbers, and Thomas's eyes caught on one in particular. XM07, German Shepherd. Failed. Failed. Thomas's chest tightened as he flipped through the rest of the documents. A pattern emerged. The dogs that failed were considered liabilities. They were deemed untrainable, unpredictable, and ultimately expendable. A sinking feeling settled over him as he began piecing the story together. Luna, XM07, had been part of this facility, but she hadn't just been abandoned because she failed their training. There was more to it. One final document caught his attention. It described a recent police raid on the facility, prompted by reports of illegal activity. The raid had shut the operation down, but not before several dogs and records went missing. Thomas glanced back at the paw prints leading away from the truck. Whoever had owned Luna and her pups must have been fleeing the raid when they decided to cut their losses. They had left her to die, along with her litter, in an attempt to erase the evidence of their cruelty. But why would a mother dog like Luna fail their training? He thought back to her actions in the forest, her unwavering determination to protect her pups, even at the expense of her own life. It wasn't hard to see why she hadn't fit their mold. Luna wasn't a guard dog, she was a protector, but in a way they didn't value. Thomas folded the documents and tucked them into his jacket. His jaw clenched as he looked at the truck one last time before turning back toward the trail. The trip back to the cabin felt heavier, the weight of what he had discovered pressing down on him with every step. He replayed the words on the note over and over in his mind. Don't trust them. Don't let them live. What kind of people would look at an animal like Luna, a mother fighting to keep her pups alive, and see something that needed to be destroyed? When he reached the cabin, Luna's eyes immediately met his. She was lying near the fire, her pups nestled against her side, and she lifted her head slightly at his return. Thomas knelt beside her, pulling the folded papers from his jacket and setting them on the table. He looked at her, his voice low and steady. "They wanted you gone," he said, "but you're still here." Luna tilted her head, her ears twitching slightly as though she understood. Thomas exhaled, leaning back against the wall. Whatever had happened at that facility, whatever cruelty she had endured, it hadn't broken her. She had defied them, protected her pups, and survived against impossible odds. "You're not just any dog, are you?" he murmured, his gaze softening as he watched her. "You're a fighter." Luna's eyes flicked to her pups, then back to Thomas. There was a quiet strength in her gaze, one that told him she wasn't done fighting yet. As the fire crackled and the warmth filled the cabin, Thomas made a silent promise to her and her pups. They had been abandoned, hunted, and left to die, but not anymore. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he would face them with her. Because some lives were worth protecting, no matter the cost. Back at the cabin, Thomas sat at his desk, the collar from Luna lying beside his laptop. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting long shadows across the room. Luna lay near the fire with her puppies, her amber eyes following his movements with quiet vigilance. The number etched into the metal collar, XM07, had been haunting him since he first saw it. The files he had found in the abandoned truck painted a grim picture, but Thomas had a feeling there was more to the story. Much more. He typed the sequence of letters and numbers into the search engine, his fingers hesitating briefly over the keyboard. What he was about to find, he couldn't say, but the pit in his stomach told him it wasn't going to be good. The screen loaded, and at first nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The results pointed to a few generic articles about dog breeding and training, but as Thomas scrolled further, a link caught his eye. It was buried deep among the results, the URL a string of nonsensical characters that didn't make sense. The title of the page read, "Restricted File, Canine Operations, XM07. Thomas frowned. His hand hovered over the mouse, his curiosity battling with his instincts. Clicking on the link could mean trouble, but he was already in too deep to stop now. He clicked. A password prompt appeared on the screen. Thomas cursed under his breath, unsure how to proceed. Then he remembered the documents he'd found in the truck. Digging through his jacket, he pulled out the leather folder and rifled through its contents. One of the papers contained a handwritten set of codes. He typed them in one by one until, finally, the screen changed. A flood of documents and videos filled the screen. Thomas's eyes widened as he skimmed the files, his stomach turning with every line he read. The facility that had trained Luna wasn't just a simple dog training center. It was part of a larger operation involved in illegal activities, smuggling, weapon trafficking, and even organized crime. The dogs were trained not only as guards, but as tools of intimidation and violence. They were conditioned to attack on command, to kill if necessary, and to defend shipments of illegal goods with their lives. Thomas's hands tightened into fists as he read further. The methods used to train the dogs were cruel and inhumane. Deprivation, physical abuse, and psychological torment were standard practice. Any dog that showed signs of resistance or failed to meet their standards was eliminated. Then he found a file labeled XM07 Behavioral Evaluation. Thomas hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He opened the file, and a video began to play. The grainy footage showed a stark training room, cold and industrial. Luna was in the center, her coat clean but her posture tense. She was younger, her body unscarred, but her eyes carried the same fierce determination Thomas had seen in the forest. A man entered the frame, holding a metal rod. He pointed to a cage in the corner of the room where a small, trembling puppy was confined. Thomas recognized the puppy immediately. It was Shadow, the smallest of Luna's litter. The man barked a command, his voice sharp and cruel. Luna didn't move. The man repeated the command, louder this time, and when Luna still refused, he struck her with the rod. She yelped, but didn't back down. Her eyes were locked on the cage, her body positioned protectively between the man and the puppy. The man's frustration grew. He struck her again, this time harder, but Luna only growled, low and threatening. When he moved toward the cage, Luna lunged. The video ended abruptly as chaos erupted in the room. Thomas sat back in his chair, his chest tight. It all made sense now. Luna hadn't failed because she was untrainable. She had failed because she refused to comply with cruelty. She had defied her trainers to protect her pups, even at the cost of her own safety. No wonder she had been scarred, beaten, and ultimately abandoned. To the facility, she was a liability, a dog that couldn't be controlled. Thomas ran a hand over his face, trying to process what he had just seen. Luna wasn't just a victim, she was a survivor, and her pups weren't just innocent bystanders, they were evidence. As he scrolled through more files, a chilling realization began to form. The note he had found in the truck, "Don't trust them. Don't let them live," wasn't a warning. It was a directive. Whoever had abandoned Luna and her pups hadn't done it out of carelessness or desperation. They had done it to erase the evidence of their crimes. And now, if anyone from that facility discovered that Luna and her pups were still alive, they would come back to finish the job. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He looked over at Luna, who had lifted her head to watch him. Her eyes, filled with both exhaustion and resilience, met his. "You've been through hell," he said softly, "and they're not done with you yet." Luna let out a soft whine, her gaze shifting to her pups, as if to reassure herself that they were still safe. Thomas stood, his jaw set. Whoever had done this to Luna and her family wasn't going to get a second chance. He wouldn't let them. Moving to the cabinet by the door, he grabbed his hunting rifle and checked the ammunition. Then he secured the windows and doors, double-checking every lock. "Let them come," he muttered, his voice low but firm. "We'll be ready." The night was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Thomas sat near the fire, absently stroking Luna's head as she lay beside him. The puppies were nestled in a bundle of blankets, their tiny bodies rising and falling with peaceful breaths. For a moment, everything felt safe. Then, it started. A distant howl echoed through the trees, long and drawn out, sending a shiver up Thomas's spine. Luna's ears perked immediately, her body tensing. The howl was familiar. The wolves were back. But before Thomas could rise, another sound joined the howling, one that didn't belong to the forest. Engines. The low rumbling growl of engines cut through the stillness, growing louder with each passing second. Thomas's pulse quickened as he moved to the window. Pulling back the curtain just enough to see, his stomach dropped. Two men, clad in dark jackets and carrying rifles, stepped out of a black SUV parked just beyond the tree line. Their faces were partially obscured by scarves, but their intent was clear. They moved purposefully, their weapons slung low but ready, scanning the forest as they advanced toward the cabin. "Damn it," Thomas muttered under his breath. He turned to Luna, who was already on her feet, her body trembling, but her growl low and menacing. "Stay with me, girl." He moved quickly, grabbing the bundle of blankets containing the puppies and heading toward the trapdoor at the far end of the cabin. Beneath it lay a small makeshift cellar, originally meant for storing food and supplies. It would have to do. He gently placed the puppies inside, making sure they were tucked safely against the insulated walls. Luna followed him to the trapdoor, her growl growing louder as the sound of boots crunching in the snow drew nearer. Thomas knelt beside her, placing a hand on her head. "I need you to stay calm," he whispered, meeting her amber eyes. "We'll get through this." He secured the trapdoor, hiding it beneath an old rug before grabbing his hunting rifle from the corner. Checking the ammunition, he took a deep breath, his mind racing. Whoever these men were, they weren't here by chance. They were connected to the operation he'd uncovered. They knew about Luna, and they wanted her gone. The knock came moments later, loud and forceful, shaking the wooden door on its hinges. "Open up!" a rough voice barked from the other side. "We know you're in there!" Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he positioned himself by the window, his rifle at the ready. He could see their shadows moving just outside, their voices low and urgent. "This isn't a game," the second man called out. "We just want what's ours. Hand over the dog, and we'll leave you alone." Luna's growl deepened, her body poised as if ready to attack. Thomas could feel the tension radiating from her. She wasn't going to let them take her or her pups without a fight. The first man tried the door handle, shaking it violently when he found it locked. "Last warning," he shouted. "Open the door, or we'll open it for you." Thomas steadied his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. The next moment was chaos. The door burst open with a deafening crack as the men forced their way inside, rifles raised. Luna lunged without hesitation, her growl erupting into a furious snarl as she charged the nearest intruder. The man stumbled back, cursing as her teeth sank into his arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. Thomas took the opportunity to fire, the rifle's crack echoing through the cabin. The second man ducked, the shot grazing his shoulder, and he dove for cover behind the overturned table. "Damn it, get her off me!" the first man yelled, struggling against Luna's relentless attack. Blood stained his sleeve as he swung wildly, trying to dislodge her. Thomas moved quickly, his focus shifting to the second man. Another shot rang out, this time striking the man's rifle, sending it skidding across the floor. Disarmed, he lunged toward Thomas, but Thomas met him with the butt of his rifle, knocking him to the ground. Meanwhile, Luna's ferocity had overwhelmed the first man. With one final, desperate swing, he managed to shove her off, but not before she left deep gashes along his arm. He staggered back, clutching the wound, his face pale. "Forget it!" he shouted to his partner. "We're out of here!" The second man scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy and panicked. Together they stumbled out of the cabin, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had come. The sound of their SUV starting and speeding away faded into the distance, leaving the cabin in silence once more. Thomas lowered his rifle, his breaths heavy as he scanned the room. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the overturned furniture bore the marks of the struggle, but they were safe. For now. Luna stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving, her amber eyes locked on the open doorway. Blood matted her fur where the man had struck her, but her stance was unwavering. She let out a low growl, as if daring them to come back. Thomas set the rifle down and approached her cautiously. "Easy, girl," he said softly. "It's over." Luna turned to him, her growl fading as her gaze softened. She limped slightly as she moved toward the trap door, whining softly. Thomas knelt beside her, placing a hand on her head. "You did good," he murmured. "Real good." He opened the trap door, revealing the puppies still bundled safely inside. Luna nosed her way down, immediately checking on each of them, her body relaxing as they responded with faint whimpers. Thomas sat back, exhaustion washing over him. The reality of what had just happened hit him hard. These men weren't random thugs. They were part of the operation that had trained Luna, and now they knew she was alive. "They're not going to stop," he said aloud, his voice heavy. "They'll come back." Luna looked up at him, her eyes steady and resolute. There was no fear in her gaze, only the same fierce determination that had kept her and her pups alive this long. Thomas stood, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the damaged cabin. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. But this time, he wouldn't just be defending Luna and her pups. He'd be taking the fight to them. The morning after the chaos, the forest was still. The snow-covered landscape bore no trace of the events that had unfolded in the night. Inside the cabin, Thomas sat at his small, weathered table, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his resolve unbroken. Luna lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, while the puppies snuggled together in a warm heap of blankets. The sound of tires crunching through the snow broke the silence. Rising quickly, Thomas moved to the window, his rifle still within reach. A wave of relief washed over him as he recognized the vehicles approaching. It wasn't the men from the night before. It was the local animal rescue organization, accompanied by a police cruiser. Thomas stepped outside, the cold air biting his skin as he greeted the team. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, approached with a firm handshake. "You must be Thomas," the officer said. "We got your call. Looks like you've had quite a night." "That's putting it mildly," Thomas replied with a faint smirk, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "They came looking for her." He gestured toward Luna, who had stepped cautiously onto the porch, her body tense, but her eyes alert. The rescue team moved in slowly, their voices soft and reassuring as they approached the shepherd. Luna watched them carefully, her gaze flicking to Thomas as if seeking his approval. "She's been through hell," Thomas said, his tone softening. "But she's a fighter. She saved me as much as I saved her." The team worked efficiently, examining Luna and her pups. The officer took Thomas aside, listening intently as he recounted the events of the past few days, discovering Luna in the snow, the attack on the cabin, and the evidence he had uncovered about the facility that had abused her. "We've been tracking that operation for months," the officer said, his expression darkening. "You've given us exactly what we needed to shut them down for good. Luna and her pups are living proof of their crimes." Thomas nodded, his eyes drifting back to Luna. She stood quietly as the team checked her, her gaze never straying far from her pups. "What happens to her now?" he asked. "She and the puppies will be taken to a secure facility," the officer explained. "They'll get medical care, and once the investigation is over, we'll work on finding them permanent homes." Thomas's chest tightened at the thought of letting her go. He glanced at the smallest puppy, Shadow, who was nestled against Luna's side. The tiny dog had grown stronger over the past few days, but it still clung to its mother with a quiet, fragile dependence. "I'd like to keep him," Thomas said suddenly, his voice steady. "Shadow. The little one. He's fought so hard to survive. I can't let him go." The officer smiled faintly. "I don't think anyone would argue with that." The rescue team loaded Luna and the other puppies into their vehicle, handling them with care. As they prepared to leave, Luna turned, her amber eyes locking onto Thomas. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the crunch of snow. Luna let out a low whine, her gaze lingering for a heartbeat longer before she turned to settle beside her pups. Later that day, as the sun began to set, Thomas stood outside the cabin, watching Shadow explore the snow for the first time. The tiny dog bounded clumsily through the drifts, his soft black and tan fur glinting in the fading light. A faint movement in the distance caught Thomas's eye. Luna stood at the edge of the tree line, her silhouette framed by the orange glow of the setting sun. She watched him and Shadow with a calm, steady gaze, her body relaxed and her posture peaceful. Thomas raised a hand in silent acknowledgement, and for the first time, he saw Luna's tail wag ever so slightly. It was a brief, subtle motion, but it spoke volumes. A ray of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting a golden beam across the snowy landscape. Shadow barked happily, chasing the light as it danced across the ground. Thomas smiled, a deep sense of peace settling over him. The past few days had been a whirlwind of chaos and danger, but they had emerged stronger. Luna and her pups had found safety, and Shadow had found a home. As the light faded and the first stars appeared in the sky, Thomas turned back toward the cabin, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Because even in the darkest of times, there was always hope.